Welcome, everyone. One of the key questions that a lot of our founders and a lot of people in the ecosystem are asking themselves is how to embrace diversity and inclusion. And today we have a very special guest, Hephzi Pemberton, a very good friend, and I'll have her introduce herself in a second. But we're going to be talking about that very subject because she just launched a new book, the Diversity Playbook. You want to hold it up, Hephzi?
Sure.
There we go.
Yes.
You can get that on Amazon now, and it's a great read. But we're going to be covering it so you can get a sense for what's in it before you buy it, or actually after you buy it, you can double down on it. So there you go. But before we go a little bit more into Hephzi and her background in the book, I also want to take this chance to introduce one of our newest team members, Alex Lewis. He's our he's only been in the team for 4 months, but he's already making a big impact, and he's our talent manager. So Alex, opportunity for you. Please tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up with us.
Sure. Well, hello, everyone. Yeah, I'm Alex Lewis. I've been in the talent ecosystem for about 6 or 7 years. I've been an agency recruiter, spent the bulk of my career as an embedded consultant. I've had the opportunity to get involved in scaling startups and businesses around the globe, which has been an awesome experience so far. And as Carlos mentioned, I've recently joined the Seedcamp team to help the portfolio set up the best of talent and people infrastructure right from the off so that they're effectively scaling. Awesome.
Well, Alex will be guiding the conversation with me today. But before we get kickstarted on that conversation, I would love it if Hephzi, you could introduce yourself a little bit about what led to the creation of this book, and some of the businesses and startups that you've helped, and also your entrepreneurial background.
Yeah, great. Well, it's lovely to be here with you today, Carlos and Alex. So thank you for the invitation. And so I'm Hephzi Pemberton, and I'm the author of the Diversity Playbook, and also the founder and CEO of Equality Group, which is my third business. It's very focused, specialist firm around inclusion, diversity, and equity, and how you really embed that in a business and use it as a driver of strategic growth. Very much the S in ESG, it's about social sustainability and people and driving that, all the benefits that you get from harnessing social sustainability, so greater innovation, productivity, bottom line profitability, long-term value that's built from that. And I've been working in the sort of people and talent space for coming up to 15 years now. I started as an investment banker at Lehman Brothers. I had nothing to do with the bankruptcy. I left a few weeks before and moved to New York and worked for a search firm. And a year later, I set up my first business with a co-founder, which was Kia Consultants, a specialist search firm for asset management, and built that and grew that business over 7 years. And then when I exited that business, I started a social enterprise supporting female micro-entrepreneurs in Uganda. We work with over 350 women, helping them digitize their small businesses using mobile-first technology. And then I set up Equality Group, and that was 3 years ago. And since then, I've been advising businesses on this topic, both headhunting diverse leadership talent, so really boost diversity within the most senior functions, executive functions, but also consulting with firms on how do you create effective strategy, how do you capture and measure and monitor the right data, how do you build out key activities and initiatives that are going to make this part of the growth driver of a business, not just a sort of nice to have employee grassroots activity, or indeed just something that's sitting alongside HR. It needs to be much broader than that. And businesses that are having the greatest success from this are combining it across product, marketing, branding, HR, strategy. You're seeing a lot of different heads of businesses coming together and using the DEI lens, as we call it, to unlock new markets, new innovations, new talent pools, and all of that's coming together to create a lot of growth and value. And I absolutely love it. It's my favorite business. It's very exciting. It's very rewarding. And it's the reason why I wrote this book. This is my first book, but there's a lot of the background and history of the work that I've been doing within the talent space that goes into it, as well as this specialist knowledge around DEI. I'm also an angel investor. I've invested in 11 startups two have been fantastic and have thankfully paid for the investments of the others. A few have failed, and there's, you know, a handful that we still have to see how they turn out, which Carlos will be even more familiar with. But I'm deeply passionate about business and about businesses' potential to really impact society in a positive way and create the sort of innovations that we need to see. I think in the last year, there's been such a spotlight on the inequalities that the global pandemic has brought. And I think business has a real chance and opportunity to, you know, level the playing fields and create ways of allowing more people into the workplace and to really harness their full potential. And I love to partner with businesses that share that sort of mission. And the great thing about this sort of DEI lens is that's very aligning. You know, if you really believe in equality, diversity, and inclusion, then, you know, we're going to be operating on the same page, and it's going to be a great partnership. And if you don't, we're probably not going to end up working together. And, you know, that's probably good for both of us. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's super amazing to hear your background. I totally, it lapsed my mind when I was reading the book that you had been at Lehman Brothers. So the comment about Lehman Sisters
Yes.
now totally clicked. I don't know if you want to, before I go into the chapters of the book, do you want to tell that part of the book, what you said in that bit?
Yes, it's a comment on people's understanding of diversity. And I said, you know, that at the time when Lehman Brothers failed, there was some commentary in the press around if it had been Lehman Sisters, it wouldn't have failed. And my point was that a group of white women are just as homogeneous as a group of white men. And, you know, we need diversity from every perspective to really mitigate for that problem of groupthink and the blindness that comes into homogeneous groups.
Excellent. Well, let's get into the chapters of the book, because I think you've set up a really good structure for people to follow and actually take action, which is great to see in a book that is about taking action at the end of the day. And it starts off with the first 3 chapters really kind of setting the tone for the leadership driving the change, and it has to come from the top. And you talk about some of the inclusive leadership traits, and, you know, you talk about things like positive commitment, courage and humility, awareness of bias, curiosity and active listening. I won't go through all of them, so you know, if you want to talk about them, you can. Then you flow on to diversity and inclusion, data management and measurement. And this is, I think, an area that a lot of people are a bit stuck on, because it is hard. It is hard, right? Like if you didn't have some sort of policy or data management or collection before, then it's like, how do I start? Where do I start? And then if you are a brand new company, maybe it's a little easier, but then it's like, at what point does it feel overwhelming? And so, you know, there's a good chapter about that. Then you talk about the actual act of hiring more inclusively. Then you move on to the inclusion and diversity initiatives that you can launch within a company. Then you move on to how to design the optimal infrastructure and policies to attract, retain, and develop diverse teams, which is really important because it's not just about an individual, it's about teams. Then you conclude the book with the social sustainability and call to action for business leaders globally. And, you know, it's a very powerful sort of conclusion to the book. But one thing I also like is that each chapter has a conclusion that is a call to action, because it has a series of exercises of audits of sort of questions to ask yourself about each one of the subjects covered. So I just wanted to ask you quickly, before we go into each individual section, is what was the rationale behind this particular structure? I mean, I think structuring a book is like writing half of it, right? Like I find that when I wrote Fundraising Field Guide, that it was like, once I got the table of contents done, it was half the battle. So maybe walk us through why this structure, and if there's any alternative structure that you considered.
Yes, this structure came together really around the work that I've been doing with some key clients, so that had gone through the whole process, the advisory process about how do we do this, you know, some sort of board and management level through to the data capture, the strategy build, and obviously then redesigning the processes, the people processes from recruitment through to reviews, retention. So there was already, I had a sense of what actually works, and I wanted each of those parts to be in it. And then I obviously wanted it framed within the broader sustainability conversation. And I started with leadership, and because it's, you know, you've got to have buy-in from the top. That is not to say that this topic doesn't come onto the conversation from, you know, any employee in an organization. And we've partnered with firms where this has really come from, a group of people in a firm coming together and say, we've got to do better. And so the reason for the structure of the book really came from the work that I've done with many companies, seeing what actually works, from engaging the leadership, helping them build a clear narrative around the value of diversity, to strategy, to clear data capture and management, to all the other people, talent processes that need redesigning to some instances. And then that was quite clearly needed to be bookended at the beginning and the end to frame this within the larger sustainability conversation. So when I knew the content I wanted to bring in the middle from the work that I've done with clients, the message at the beginning, which was like, why this is the time, why businesses have to do this now, and all the events of the last year, and the inequalities of the pandemic, the murder of George Floyd, all these things factoring into an urgency around this topic, with the call to action at the end. So it did come together quite naturally. There could have been a different structure, but as you know, there's a strong sense of intuition with writing, and this one, when I wrote it out, it came together very, very quickly. Whereas an alternative one, which basically had a different ordering, it was just slower and it was harder. So that was then made the decision for me.
That's a good enough reason why. That's a good enough reason why. All right, well, let's go into each one of the chapters. We don't have to spend like any one amount of time on any one of them. Just feel free to pick on all the key ideas of each one. But let's start with those first three, because they seem to fit naturally together, because they were a little bit of an introduction, but then leadership from the top as a core concept. What are the key ideas that you want to unpack there?
Yeah, I think the key thing is about inclusive leadership, what that actually looks like. What are the real qualities and values of an inclusive leader? How do you develop those in yourself? Because I fundamentally believe we can all become more inclusive. That is a lifelong journey. And wherever you are on that, you can always do more and develop more. And that is going to have real tangible benefits for your business and for your culture. So I wanted to sort of inspire and push leaders on that this has to come from you, and it has to be a very authentic and lived experience. And we all come with our own unique life backgrounds, our different demographic factors, but also our lived experiences, and all of that is going to feed into how we relate to this topic and what we think actually needs doing or not doing. And I obviously unpack the concept of privilege. Privilege is something we're not often aware of. We just live with it. It's like a fish doesn't know it's swimming in water. I don't know what it's like to come from a different background to the one I've come from. I need to go out of my comfort zone to find out, and I need to do that work. And that is on me. That is my responsibility. And we need leaders to take that seriously. They can't just talk about this being important and then not be willing to do some of the work themselves. And so I put the responsibility on their shoulders, but I talk about the qualities that you need to develop in your character, your character that you're building in this, such as empathy and humility and awareness of bias and privilege, all of these things that are all going to feed into the later stages that come, and will hopefully mean that you're really living out the values of inclusion and diversity, that then your team can see that. And also you're going to be very, very willing to get things wrong, because you are going to get things wrong and you are going to mess up. You've got to accept that. And this process is going to move you into it. Just the reflection process and the exercises help you to do that too. So that, you've already started the journey as a leader before you ask the organization to do anything, before you ask anyone else to do anything. And that is so important.
Absolutely, I completely agree. But it'd be great to know for, I suppose, some of the founders that are listening, self-reflections can be quite difficult, but what can the founders do to start to educate themselves, and what should they be thinking about in the early stages about making sure they're learning?
Yeah, I actually outline an inner circle exercise, it's called, where I get people to think about the 5 people that they're closest to, not family, but anyone else, your mentor, who maybe your closest board member or investor, or your friend, a couple of friends. And I get you to sort of score them on different diversity demographic characteristics, and then look at that holistically and see, you know, the type of people that are in your inner circle. And when I first did this exercise, you know, unsurprisingly, I had a lot of very well educated women. They're actually racially quite diverse, sexuality quite diverse, but you know, we were women within a certain age bracket and we had a certain education level. And I had one guy and I thought, you know, I want to build more balance into this. And I actively did that over a couple of years through mentors that I had, but I probably didn't proactively reach out to as much. And also with the boards that I built for Equality Group, which is by far the most diverse board I've ever built or ever sat on. And I've sat on a few boards, but I really consciously did that as a result of that exercise. So I think that as a very practical first step is good because it gives you the data, your personal data on this, and it helps you build a more diverse inner circle so that then what you do is the conversations that you have out of that, the interaction, you know, there's a lot of learning that comes through that. And there's other sort of tools in here as well, like I talk about doing the IAT, which is the Harvard Implicit Association test, a very, very robust test looking at bias associations. And it's across all sorts of different factors. You know, you can do it on gender, race, sexuality, socio-economic factors. And it's worth doing because, again, it gives you some helpful data to reflect upon. And it's quite uncomfortable. It shows us, just all of us, how biased we are, and gives us then the knowledge of what we should be working on and where we need to open up our perspective and horizons. So yeah, there's some very practical things in here, but you know, fundamentally, get out of your comfort zone and go and speak to different people and get to know different people that you don't, and listen to them, listen and understand their experiences. And that can be both within your company, but to be honest, if you haven't done this before, don't start with your team and don't start with your company. Go and do it with some other people first, and you know, do the learning. Don't use your team as the guinea pigs.
Absolutely. Where would be the best time to execute on that as an exercise?
Like immediately. Just if you haven't done that, just do it straight away, because that's gonna be the catalyst for the change that needs to happen in you, and then obviously the change process that you are going to start to implement in your organization.
So one of the things that you just mentioned, Hephzi, is that you mentioned the data a couple times in what you were sharing about doing a self-audit, and data is such a huge part in an organization in understanding the context that you're operating in today and the one that you want to operate in the future. Maybe walk us through your next chapter, which is around data management and measurement.
Yeah, this is so important. I think often people think of diversity and inclusion as a very soft topic, and actually what we have learned through Equality Group, and we've got a great academic panel that we work with of social psychologists and behavioral scientists, and actually there's lots of really good data you can get in this area. And when you get the data, then you take it a lot more seriously. You take it as seriously as if you were looking at your sales numbers or you were looking you know, at your accounts. So putting it into the same remit with the same type of information that you look at for other areas of your business is a very positive step. Now, on top of that, it obviously gives you a very clear picture of where you currently are before you decide where you want to go. And both of those steps are equally important. So there's two ways that we go about getting the data. We get the quantitative data, which is from anonymous and confidential surveys. And then we get qualitative data that comes from one-on-one interviews and from some group sessions that we facilitate with companies. So all of that, and then also obviously we can do team-wide IATs as well, which are anonymized, but give you a sort of bias map of a whole team. So there's different types of data that you can get. And the key thing is to decide what matters for your organization. And if you can be if you've done some of this work yourself, I would encourage you to be sort of a bit braver and bolder, because you don't want to be going back to a team several times within a year to ask for additional types of data. You want to communicate why you're doing it, and then you want to do it really well once in a 12-month period. And you then want to start to do something with that data and demonstrate why it matters and why it has value. So I've seen companies make the mistake of sort of going out once with like a shorter survey and then following, that was maybe just more around demographic diversity, and then following up with some sort of more inclusion metrics. And people get survey fatigue and they get diversity fatigue, and you don't want that. You want to just do it well and thoughtfully, get the right advice to do that. But before you even put out any sort of survey, or you hold any like listen and learn sessions, or people call it all sorts of different things to get that qualitative data out, you've got to do the work first yourself as the leader, and you've got to communicate why this matters, why you think it has value. And if you don't know and you can't communicate that, don't do this. If you don't know why this has value to your business, do not do this because you think it's just the thing you need to do or be shown to do, because that it will, it tends to backfire. People get very resentful. You've built up expectations, but you can't follow it through because you don't know how to link it to fundamental business value.
When you're gathering all this data, you've gone through the life cycle with one of the businesses you're working with, is there ever a point where you can sit back and go, this has been a success? What are those indicators?
Thankfully, yes. Yes, we have a very good case study, and I mentioned the CEO in the book as well. So Kinnevik is a Swedish growth fund, and the CEO there, Georgi Ganev, really took on board this topic about 3.5 years ago, and said to his board, I am going to do this. I know we've done a pretty good job on the E and the G, but the S is like, we've left that behind, and we want to make sure before we go to our portfolio companies and say, you've got to do this, we're going to do it ourselves. And brought us in at the early stages of strategy build, data collection, and then education. So we ran an education series for all of their investment team, and actually all of their sort of 40 so staff in Stockholm and London. And they set some quite ambitious goals around gender specifically. Well, gender and generational difference were the two like glaring issues initially, and they're now moving on to the topic of race and further like going deeper on inclusion metrics too. But the reason they're able to do that 2 years in is because they hit all of their targets that they set for the first strategy work around gender balance. But it was very much Georgi's like bold leadership on the topic and willingness to have some pretty uncomfortable conversations. And you've got to be prepared to have the uncomfortable conversations with the majority. One of the things that came up very early on is some of the white guys just saying, like, I'm going to be really disadvantaged now at this organization. I'm not necessarily going to get promoted. Is there a place long term here for me? And you've got to have those conversations, not just address the minority concerns. There's majority concerns, there's minority concerns. All of them have to be addressed. All of them will come out if you ask the right questions in that data gathering process.
Okay, I think that's super helpful to know, and maybe it sounds like part of that involves knowing where to stop, but also where to continue pushing forward in your hiring practices to get to that outcome. And in your next chapter, I now understand why you had it right after, is this push for how to hire better now that you have an idea of where you want to go. Maybe you can walk us through some of that. And Alex, I know that because both of you have had backgrounds in search, I mean, this is probably the bread and butter of understanding, finding the right candidates, setting up the right specs, speaking the right language, and achieving those goals.
Totally. And this was actually the one chapter in the book that did move. It was originally chapter 7, and I moved it earlier because actually I think it's just so fundamental. And it is one of the biggest questions that always gets asked on this topic. When founders are thinking about it, it's like, how do I actually find this diverse talent? How do I get it? How do I do this well? And there's so many different aspects to it. But fundamentally, when I talk about data and strategy, one of the biggest points is representation, visible representation in a company at every single level as well, because there's so much great work that happens at the junior level, and actually has been happening for many, many years. But we've got a leaky pipeline issue. We don't see that talent flowing all the way through. So you've got to prioritize it at every single level of the company. And for founders specifically, you've got to think about your founding team, and you've got to think about your board, I'd say, before you think about anything else. Because if you get that right, you're going to pull in diverse talent so much more easily. People are just going to see it and they're going to want to be it, and you're going to make your life 10 times easier, rather than sort of doing it later. And obviously you're going to do it where you have the most volume of hires. It'll be more of the junior positions, and then you've got to solve for all the retention and promotion things later on as well, which hopefully you'd set up those structures well initially, and then also that would go smoothly. But key concepts in this chapter are looking at some of the academic research around this. So the fact, how bias plays out, the fact that, racial minorities in industries will have to do 60% more work to get an interview than people with white names. And there's been some huge CV studies done around that. And then, then looking at like anonymization as a good technique. Now that gets harder when you're getting into senior level hires, where maybe you've only got like 3 or 4 names, and you sort of, who they are, right? You can't really anonymize. What you've got to do there is be highly intentional and proactive. You've got to go out and identify more diverse talent, and it's going to take you longer. You've got to accept that. I always say efficiency is the enemy of diversity. So you've got to extend your timeline. You've got to be willing to put in a little bit more work, because you're going to get the value and the results later on from that additional time. 2 or 3 months we're talking about, but often, when I'm talking with leaders, they feel like that's too long. And it's like, no, not if you're going to get all the benefits of having that diverse leadership team in place over multiple years. So it's definitely worth doing. And also just tapping into new networks that you haven't spoken to before, and not relying on your existing, previous, or your sourcing channels. Just got to do things differently. If you do the same thing, you're going to get the same results. So that's a fundamental principle in this chapter. If you've been getting the same type of people over a few years, you've got to change your process. And I talk about different ways of changing that process.
This topic comes up a lot when I speak to the portfolio, and especially because we're so early stages. If we have the founders coming and starting to look at bringing in new leadership, if they feel there's a huge amount of pressure, because this topic is such a global piece at the moment, that there's a lot of social pressure, and there, as a consequence, is a lot of emotion attached to this as a subject. And they come to me and say, I'm stuck between hiring someone who I believe is the right candidate, but may not be diverse representation, versus giving more diverse candidate the opportunity to step up. How would you advise our founders to look at this pragmatically in the right way?
Yeah, that is such a good point, Alex. I think it's, I hear it as the pushback of like, I don't want to lower the bar. And it's like, you need to look at your bar. Why is diversity not a key value in the bar? Why would that be perceived as something that would be lowering it rather than actually raising it? And so it's the mindset, it's the mindset of diversity has fundamental value to my business. I need this. I'm going to be at real risk of groupthink, affinity bias. We're going to miss things. We're going to miss opportunities. We're going to miss talent. We're going to miss markets. We're not going to innovate as much if we don't get this in. So that reprioritization of fundamentally how valuable diversity is to your business helps overcome that, because then rather than saying, oh, either I have the best candidate or I have the diverse candidate, it's like, no, if I have the diverse best candidate, that's the very best. So it starts with that perception and that mindset. And again, why at the beginning of the book, I talk about really understanding the fundamental business value and getting to grips with that yourself as a leader, because then it becomes so much easier when you're getting into hiring and saying why we are prioritizing this talent pool or these new networks in a way that maybe you haven't done before, but now you're understanding the value of doing so. And it means you end up reframing how you're positioning your roles and who you're going after. And I think another area that also requires that reframing is like leadership potential. Like, how are you evaluating for that? And I think I see a number of organizations needing to shift out of like a classic sort of command control leadership style into much more of an empathetic, collaborative, type of leader, one that balances masculine and feminine traits, whether they are a man or a woman, it doesn't matter, but has a much more of a balance in their value set and their capabilities and their characteristics. And that needs rethinking a lot of the time.
It's, being able to interview like that is quite difficult, especially for inexperienced founders potentially. So how would you go about assessing that balance?
Yeah, so I talk about how you should structure interviews and say that, you need to make sure you're building in wisdom of the crowd into your interview process. So building a good sort of interview panel that is going to be able to assess the different factors that you need assessing, and thinking about values and traits and characteristics, as well as just like fundamentally what have you done in your career, like output. And making sure that you have some level of standardization as well. So again, you can extract the right data from these interviews and then look at it holistically with that different input from the panel. And then and reference checking. So about soft references, different perspectives from the market on an individual and how they've performed. But unless you've got a clear framework for what really matters and what you're evaluating, then you're not going to be able to get effective soft references either. So that initial piece of thinking around what you're really looking for and why you're looking for it then should inform the rest of the process.
Well, I mean, we've covered a lot of the flow to this point around not only assessing where you are, but assessing yourself, and then therefore having a starting point by which to search. But then there is the steady state. There's the infrastructure you need to set up on an ongoing basis to really keep this initiative going. And it's everything from the training to everything having to do with policies and making sure that it's sort of that encompass that whole feeling. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about, and maybe take opportunity in this particular section, is to talk about the applicability at the early stage, because some of the ideas that you share are amazing ideas, but they might be a bit daunting relative to the size of the organization. In particular, I'm going to call out the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force, and when that is appropriate and when it isn't, and just playing around with these ideas. I know it's not the last chapter in the book, but I do think it's a good sort of way to conclude the structure of the book. Is how will these policies, infrastructure, and ideas and groups fit at different stages of the company?
Yeah. I think at the early stage, founding seed stage business, and I'm sort of having gone through it myself, building a quality group again. The important thing is definitely the diversity of the advisory board and of your leadership team. I think if you're very intentional and effectively do that, you're going to make your life so much easier longer term. Of course, you need to be thinking about putting in the right policies early on, whether it's shared parental leave, flexible working, having clear non-discrimination policies. They're just like foundational blocks so that anyone coming into the organization knows what you stand for and how they're going to be treated. But I think diversity of the leadership and doing that well initially is the number one thing you should be doing as a founder at the early stages. And that is going to pull in more diversity over time, because that's how networks operate. Whoever you are, when you fill in that inner circle, you're going to have more people like you than other people. that's what happens. We all do it. We all have affinity bias. So if you can get those different networks pulled into your company at the senior most leadership levels early on, you're going to reap a lot of benefits from that.
So you were mentioning like policies and stuff from the off. So do you feel that you should start implementing a D&I strategy almost immediately?
Absolutely. And it's not a huge amount of work to do, actually. And there's just some amazing templates out there. And I reference a lot of those. I think it's great because it signals your values, and values are the bedrock of culture. So unless you're clear about what your values are, then you're not really going to have a very strong culture. So embedding DEI early on and having a strategy, and it doesn't need to be much. It just needs to be about representation. It needs to be about clear and progressive policies, and it needs to be these are some of the key activities that we will be doing, whether it's like who we partner with in our supply chain, service providers, really just having that thought to the diversity of your entire ecosystem around the business. That is, it will be self-perpetuating. After a certain point as a leader, you won't need to be doing as much of it because everyone else, it will be in the lifeblood of the company. People are like, this is how we operate because we value it and we've seen the benefits of it already because it's been in from day one.
I'm not sure if you've seen in the news or on social media the BrewDog story that's emerged. BrewDog as a brand have scaled like massively, and there's been a bit of public outcry about the culture and how that's scaled. So this is something we see quite a lot. Unfortunately, it's come into the public sphere because they have such a publicly driven marketing strategy.
Yeah.
So James Watt's come out and publicly sort of apologized and is looking at what the next steps for the business are. That to me symbolizes what we were talking about just before we kicked off about people debt. And is that something that can be fixed by putting in the right policies straight away, or does that come in as you're more like assessing as you grow?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just catching up this and reading about, yes, this is a sort of toxic culture issue that's been perpetuated from the top, and you've now had a load of employees write about it. Yeah. Yeah, policies are not going to solve that. Policies are going to be probably part of correcting it, but you've got a lot of very upset and hurt people. So there's quite a lot of deep emotional work that's going to need to be done. And I don't know enough about what has actually been going on. So I don't want to sort of comment out of turn, but there's probably a lot of responsibility that's going to fall back onto the leadership to correct this.
Actually, it's an interesting point you make, Hephzi, about maybe the two-way relationship that leaders have with employees where things go wrong. And maybe this is an interesting point to talk a little bit about that sort of circular feedback loop. I presume a lot of founders are probably going to make mistakes. And it's scary. It's scary to make mistakes, right? And especially in any subject that is emotionally loaded, because it's the word you used, and it can be even more paralyzing to take risks or make change if you know that there's an emotional outcome or impact that could follow. What do you recommend to set up as a feedback loop, or how do you recommend for founders to communicate the possibility that there's a feedback loop when there are mistakes that are going to happen, because you're going to make them? Yeah,
no, absolutely. And I think why doing this early on is so important, because when you're looking at the topic of inclusion, that is going to cover emotions and feelings, how much people feel part of the company, how aligned they feel to the values, how effective they think feedback loops are in the business, how represented they feel by the leadership. So actually putting in some good inclusion practices early on is hopefully going to give you the opportunity to course correct before you get some major build-up of toxic culture that results in, things hitting the press and groups of employees writing letters or mass resignations that can happen. So I think you've got to have both some regular employee surveys for anonymized, confidential, and people really have to trust that is anonymous and confidential, because if it's not, then they're not going to be as honest as they need to be. And I think you need to have some sort of open door or open Zoom policy as a leader to hear the feedback. I think you also need to be working with a coach. I think any leader and founder should be working with a coach, because that person is going to be your accountability soundboard, and they can also run 360s for you, annual 360s, because that's another very, very helpful way of you understanding how you're getting on as a leader, but also how everyone's perceiving what you're doing and the direction that you're taking the company. And just being able to get this feedback earlier and then address it, even if you don't want to necessarily change what you're doing. often you just need to communicate more about why you are doing what you are doing, so people understand, and you take away, the backroom chatter, or the the suspicion that maybe there's some different motivations behind why you're doing what you're doing. So it really improves the communication. At the same time, it might be that you do want to sort of course correct a little bit what's going on culturally from what's come up. So the more you can get that input and that data and that feedback in a few different ways. Like I know companies that just rely on the employee survey feedback. I don't think that's sufficient. I think you need to be held accountable by a coach. You also need to be taking this back to the board, and it's a very, very important part of running your business.
Yeah, that's a very good point to conclude on, because I think it's fear or anxiety should not be a paralyzing force for change. It's just part of the bravery required to make that process better. So it's been exciting to hear about the book and some of the ideas that created it, and it's amazing to see the good work. It's exciting to get it out there. What's been the biggest positive feedback that you've received, or maybe not feedback on the book, but just what's been the positive impact to you from since the book's launch?
Yeah, I think getting the Amazon #1 bestseller in international finance and business was great. I was really pleased about that, because I this is a business book, and I think this is such a fundamental business topic, and it's great to see sort of that recognition. And it's also just really enjoyable to get into the conversations with different types of businesses. And most of my work is with finance and tech businesses, but I've loved talking to some arts and creative industries businesses, speaking with the Royal Shakespeare Company. It's just great to see how this can impact different areas of society and different organizations within society as well. So yeah, I'm just excited to have it out there and to be engaging in the conversation, and I'm very happy to hear the pushbacks as well. I mean, that's how we all learn. So
yeah, excellent. Well, thanks for joining us, Hephzi. It's been an absolute pleasure, and also Alex, thanks for joining and leading the conversation. For those of you that are following, on the show notes, we'll have more about the book and about Hephzi if you want to get in touch. So until next time, guys. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.